Hi everyone, my name is Fritz Bacon and I am a director based in New York City. And today we will be reviewing a new lens from LUMIX that we are going to play with. This is the new LUMIX S 28-200mm. It is a variable aperture zoom lens from F4-7.1 with macro O.I.S. And let me tell you, this thing is tiny. When I first got the text about this lens, I was expecting it to be pretty big since it was a 28-200mm range. I was pleasantly surprised to see that it was the fraction of the size of my 70-200 and even smaller than my go-to 24-70. To see how this lens performs, I decided to put it through 3 tests. The first one being handheld, the second on a gimbal, and the third in my studio on a tripod. And all of these tests will be conducted on the LUMIX S5 IIX. Now let's talk about the first test, handheld. I have said this before and I'll say it again. I love shooting handheld. It keeps my footprint to a minimum and it allows me to be really flexible with how I move and where I move. So to do this, I met up with my friend Nani and she's gonna help me model. We got right into it and started out on the fire escape to really put the 6.5 stop 5-axis Dual I.S 2 that is packed into this lens to the test. I was immediately impressed with the amount of shots I was able to get in such a short amount of time. I was a little worried that at 200mm with F7.1 as sort of the minimum aperture, that I wouldn't get the depth that I normally like, but especially on those fire escape shots, the depth really came through and gave a nice cinematic feel to the shots. Now, of course, no lens test is complete without some stills, so I'll add those here. The next test was to see how the whole system would perform on a gimbal. I called my buddy Hunter, who just got an incredible new road bike that we were going to use on the subject for this. We put it up in the middle of the road on a bike stand, and to start, I just did really simple sort of left to right pans to really see how the gimbal would handle these different focal lengths. Now, a quick tip before you go putting this thing on a gimbal, you should set the lens at 75mm. That will give you the exact midway distance of the lens, allowing you to balance it so that when you are zoomed out all the way at 28 and all the way in at 200, it still balances on the gimbal without having to recalibrate because the lens is so light. We moved the bike to the sidewalk and I went back into photo mode. Now you've probably seen this before, but essentially what I did is at each focal length, I made sure to center the bike, and this allowed me to see how the depth was impacted with each focal length, and it also turns into a really cool GIF. Since it had recently snowed, the nearby basketball courts were completely deserted, so we put the bike there and saw that there were some really cool reflections going on with the melted snow, and I was really able to play with the gimbal fully and get some cool movements in at a bunch of different focal lengths, as well as I was able to sort of experiment with the macro side of this lens. And for the final test, I brought it back to the office and threw the whole system onto a tripod to see if I could get a crash zoom effect. Now, I experimented with keeping the focus on and keeping the focus off, as well as turning O.I.S. and on and off. And ultimately, my favorite result came from going with manual focus and keeping O.I.S. on, and I was able to get this cool crash zoom. This is a very intriguing lens. Sure, there's some compromises to be made, but I'm pretty blown away with what you can do with this lens. For one, it's so small. It's almost the size of a kit lens. It's super unassuming and very easy to walk around with, which is huge for my personal workflow. As we've seen throughout this whole video, the range on this is incredible, and you can go from super wide to telephoto with just the flick of a wrist. You don't have to change any lenses, which is an entirely new concept for me. This lens almost feels like a gimmick, and if I'm being honest, the whole time I was filming with it, I was expecting a fatal flaw or something that would make me just hate the lens and not want to use it again. But looking at the photos and videos from these tests, the quality is right where I wanted it to be. The only downside to this lens that I was able to find was the low light capabilities, because the lowest you can go on the aperture is 4, For example, last night I was shooting out my office window, and these images were captured at ISO about 2000. And even though the S5 IIX is great at low light, there's a little bit of noise, so I had to bring it into DaVinci and clean that up in post, which is not my favorite type of workflow. While it might not stack up against high-end cinematic primes, this lens is perfect. Say you have only a budget for one lens, you can discover a wide range of shots with your camera. Also, if you travel, this lens is incredible. For example, I love to hike. Usually when I go hiking, I have to decide whether I'm taking a telephoto or a wide-angle lens. With this, I could throw it in my bag and have both wide-angle and telephoto in a lightweight package that is super easy to get up the mountain. It's really hard not to like this lens. It's lightweight, it's unassuming, and it's got just an insane range. And I couldn't help but smile every time I went from 28 to 200, as that's something I've really never had the opportunity to do. And I'm really excited to see what kind of stories I can tell with this piece of gear.